Tomatoes, peppers, onions, garlic, that can only mean one thing, and that's that we're making salsa. Using some of the vegetables from my garden harvest for the year and subsidizing it with some produce from the market, we're going to be making and canning a whole bunch of chunky salsa. We're going to go ahead and get started by getting some water boiling so I can peel these tomatoes and chopping up these vegetables. You can use pretty much any yellow or white onions. For this recipe, I use Spanish onions. I would, however, avoid using red onions for salsa. Most salsa recipes call for green pepper. If you prefer red or orange bell pepper, you could use that, but I think green is the best in salsa for both taste and color. I like poblano peppers because they've got a good flavor and just a little zing. You can omit these or use any other type of hot pepper if you want more heat. I add just a few jalapenos because I like a little bit of heat, but not too much. Use as much or as little garlic as you like. I want some garlic flavor, but I don't want it to be overwhelmed with garlic taste. I'll finely chop about 4 or 5 big cloves. It's very easy to overdo it on the cilantro, so err on the side of caution. Unfortunately, you have to buy this big old bunch, even if you only need a little. I'm using Roma tomatoes for this, and I trim a tiny bit off both ends. If you're using a round tomato, you'll probably only need the core out the top. To remove the skins, I blanch the tomatoes. This involves putting them in boiling water for just a couple minutes and then plunging them into ice water for another few minutes. After you do this, the skins should just fall right off. Next, I roughly chop the tomatoes into chunks. They'll break down a lot while cooking, but chopping them a bit first helps the process along. Now to add all the vegetables together. My recipe calls for about 5 cups of onion, though I tend to use a bit more because I like a lot of onion. This probably came out to at least 6 cups. Next is the green pepper. Again, the recipe calls for about 5 cups. Then the poblano peppers and jalapenos. I use 2 poblanos and 3 jalapenos because this is a mild salsa recipe. If you want more heat, replace the poblano with more jalapeno, serrano, habanero, or whatever else you like. Then the finely chopped cilantro, 2 or 3 tablespoons is plenty. And then the garlic. Now it's time to cook the salsa. Basically, I heat the salsa to boiling and then reduce the heat to simmer for a while. I usually do about 20 to 30 minutes, but you can do more or less depending on how watery your tomatoes were to begin with and what consistency you like your salsa to have. Time for a quick disclaimer. This recipe, like most salsa recipes, calls for some vinegar, and many of them call for white vinegar. White vinegar is what I almost always use. This time, I happened to be out of white vinegar when I made this, and I decided to try some apple cider vinegar I had on hand instead. In hindsight, I do not recommend this. Not only is the flavor completely wrong for salsa, but apple cider vinegar is much less potent than white vinegar, so adding 1 cup did not nearly give the acidic bite I wanted. But if I added more, it would have given it even more of that wrong flavor. This salsa is still good, but it's got a very subtle sweet overtone to it and none of that acidic brightness. So again, go with white vinegar, about 1 cup for a batch this size. Before wet canning, I always sterilize my jars with steam by putting them upside down over a couple inches of boiling water for a few minutes. And as always, boil your lids for a couple of minutes. This both sterilizes them and softens up the rubber gasket just a bit. For certain foods, you need to increase the acidity a little to make extra sure that it's safe and shelf stable. For things like tomato sauce and salsa, this is commonly done by adding lemon juice or some citric acid. Depending on how much vinegar you add to the salsa, you may not need to do this, but citric acid doesn't really add any taste, and I have plenty of it on hand. So I added 1/4 teaspoon per jar. For pints, you would use 1/8 of a teaspoon. Now to fill the jars, be sure to leave about a ½ inch of headspace. After the jars are filled, use a scraper tool such as this to take care of as many bubbles as you can. Work it around the wall of the jar as best you can to try to dislodge any bubbles or trapped air. Once the jars are filled and debubbled, be sure to wipe the rims very thoroughly with a damp paper towel. We don't want any food residue getting between the jar and the lid. Use a magnetic grabber tool like this to pick up the lids and place them on the jars. Now just put on the rings and remember not to over tighten them. Processing time is 20 minutes for quarts and 15 for pints. So that means after putting the jars in the canner and turning the heat up to high, I start my timer only once the water is at a full boil. When the timer goes off, I'll turn off the heat and remove the jars. Within a couple minutes after removing from the water, the lids begin to pop. I'll leave these sitting here on the counter for an entire day undisturbed. Once they're completely down to room temperature, I'll move them to the pantry. In a cool, dark place like a pantry, this salsa will be perfectly good to eat for months to come. My rule of thumb for home canned tomato products is 12 months, but usually it doesn't take nearly that long to go through it. And finally, since dogs can't have salsa, Lena had to settle for her favorite thing ever, a spoonful of peanut butter. That's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, this is Great Lakes Prepping.